Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen. And today we have a special crossover episode with the Troublesome Terps. That's a podcast about interpreting and interpreters and issues around that. Mm-hmm. And there's two Alexes and a Jonathan. So there's Jonathan Downey from Scotland. So he has the Scottish accent. And then there's Alexander Drexel, a German living in Brussels, right?
Yes.
I got that right,
yes.
right?
And that was a beautiful pronunciation.
Oh, I don't know about that, but it wasn't the worst. And then Alexander Gansmeyer, who is in Munich. And they are all interpreters. And we chat about linguistic discrimination and interpreting.
Mm-hmm. Again, one of those things where Megan just doesn't go out beyond her own experiences and think about how these things might matter, and how, or at least how they might be related to linguistic discrimination. And of course they are, because it has to do with language. So
yeah, wherever there's language ideology.
Yep, exactly. And it's I would say a really dorky hour and a half.
Yes, it is very dorky. Charmingly dorky, I think.
Charming. I mean, and if we're talking about give and take, there's a little more take from them and give from us. Right?
They ask us more questions than we ask them, so it's a little one-sided, and we apologize. But it's a fun conversation. We thought our listeners might want to listen to it as well. Okay.
So
all right. So hope you enjoy. We'd also like to thank our two newest patrons from last month, Ian A. Cook and Christopher Phipps. Thank you so much for supporting us. And just a reminder, we have bonus episodes every month. And if you're interested in hearing those, just support us at the $5 level. Thank you.
So I think I have to explain the backstory a little bit to this crossover episode. So when did you start with the idea of Vocal Fries? How did the whole thing happen? If you could just tell us that in a nutshell, I think that would be interesting.
Well, I'd been encouraged by my husband / our producer to start a podcast. And I just couldn't think of anything interesting. I was like, ask a linguist. You can just send in your questions. I don't know. And then one day I realized, that TEDx talk that I gave on linguistic discrimination is actually really important. And maybe I should, try to broaden the number of people who hear this message that linguistic discrimination is bad. And so then I thought, okay, a podcast. And then I was like, I can't do it by myself. That's boring. Mm-hmm. So I asked Megan, hey, Megan, do you want to join me? And she said yes. So.
And here we are.
And the rest is history.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because the problem is, I think that when you start out making a podcast, I think, at least that was the case for me, you think, well, is it going to be enough material to keep me going for a while? We'll probably run out of topics after episode 3. And then, when you do it, it's just, well, we should talk about this and then talk about that afterwards. And,
Yeah.
Oh, there's so many ideas that people keep coming to us
or
that we already have in our head that we haven't had a chance to get to yet. So yeah, there are unlimited number of episodes we could have.
No, I was just going to say that you guys definitely have the best podcast titles. I think we really need to take a page out of that book. I love it.
Yeah, who came up with that? Was it one
I'm
of
a
you?
sucker for punny stuff.
Yeah.
So our name, the Vocal Fries, or
the Vocal Fries, yeah.
Both, yeah.
In the titles of the episodes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Vocal Fry's name I came up with, but most of the titles Megan comes up with, she's a better punner than I am.
I mean,
I love it.
Jonathan, we should have a pun battle in this episode.
Oh
Jonathan is our resident punster.
I do enjoy a good pun, but I also enjoy behaving myself. Although it depends. I was in a really, really cheeky mood earlier today, so there may be some sarcasm coming. I'm not sure.
But also, who says that punning is bad behavior?
Lots of people. They hate it.
Yeah, why? What's up with that? I don't know. I like a good pun.
Me too.
There was a study recently that the ability to pun on the hoof is associated with very high linguistic intelligence.
Yeah.
But I also think the ability to do several puns in a row is correlated with the number of black eyes that you get every month.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
My dad can do it. Like, he is the punster. It's amazing.
I have a big brother, and when my dad was alive, my big brother, my dad, and I used to pun back to back for hours, to the point where my mum realised this was not a phase that was ever going to end.
Yeah, no.
I did first suggest when we were looking at titles, I had a great pun title, but they wouldn't let me away with it because the podcast title I wanted was Boys in the Booth.
Yeah.
Oh,
See?
I kind of like it.
Yeah. See?
But the question is, do you spell it with an S or with a Z? That's the question.
What is it? Z?
With a Z, sorry.
This side of the Atlantic. No, yeah, with a Z, of course, just to really wind up the people who can't deal with bad spelling. If you ever want to play a fun game, write an email to a translator and deliberately do some spelling errors and drop in some Oxford commas. It doesn't matter what you write, they write back for like 3 pages. It's amazing.
No, honestly, I actually once had a comma mistake in one of my out of office messages, and I literally had like a 10-line email from a colleague of mine. She was like, I usually don't do this, but I really couldn't help myself. And I was like, oh my god.
Over a comma?
Over a comma.
That sounds miserable.
I know.
Oh.
But I mean,
this was actually a pretty good segue, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the topic of your podcast, of the Vocal Fries, which is specifically about linguistic discrimination and how you shouldn't be an a-hole.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Love it.
What are the topics that you've covered so far, just to give people an idea who may have not listened to one of your episodes yet, which they totally should.
Right. Well, our first episode was about Vocal Fry.
Yeah.
Which
I love it.
exactly. That was an example of it right there. And how actually a lot of English speakers use it. Probably everybody does to a certain extent. And it's not actually all that gendered. Men use it too. But we just don't notice it in men.
Yeah.
We did grammar, so, all the Oxford.
I need to re-listen that one, apparently.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about Oxford commas, I don't think.
Didn't, no, but
It's interesting because I was just looking through your kind of back catalogue, as it were. And it's really interesting to see some of the topics that actually, some of them look like a proxy for class and education. And the one that really interests me at the moment is, I don't know if you're aware of deaf people in there struggle to get their languages recognised as languages. Alex Drexel just did an absolutely genius episode on the story of how British Sign Language became a national language of Scotland.
Oh, cool.
And it's really fascinating when you get people who are what they call children of deaf adults who have lived in both cultures, and their understanding of why is it that one part of my one culture that I live in is validated and allowed and accepted, and the other part isn't, despite the fact that for me they live alongside each other.
Right.
And it's fascinating that I'm now realizing that most of what we take as linguistic issues are actually only important because they're proxies for something else. They're proxies for race or for class or for gender. And when we realize that's what we're talking about, we're not actually talking about language.
Right.
Suddenly the debate becomes a lot clearer.
Yeah, it's true. And that's a point we keep trying to bring up, is that really this is all about our prejudices that underlie everything. And we're not actually, when you attack the language, you're actually attacking the person.
Right.
But we don't think we are, so we think we're safe doing it. But no, that's what we're doing. And it's unfair and actually makes you the a-hole.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because there are times where I've had discussions with people saying, well, I would expect such and such from a professional. It's like, yes, but maybe their professionalism is showing up in slightly different ways.
Right.
Or maybe, so for instance, what I would expect from a professional in community interpreting, the sort of language they use, the way they describe their own role, the way they deal with their clients, is entirely different to what I would expect from Alex in the European institutions.
Right.
And yet, a lot of people say, you're an interpreter, you should be like this. Well, maybe you shouldn't.
Right. Yeah. So time, we always talk about time and place too. So the context of use, right? So if you're interpreting one-on-one in a more casual setting, then of course you're going to end up using more casual language. But if you're interpreting at the EU, the people talking are probably not using casual language. So you probably shouldn't be using casual language in your translations either. I mean, to me, it just seems like obvious. Where are you? What's the context? Is this more likely to be acceptable or less likely to be acceptable?
This conversation always gets me hyped up because I think about here I am hyped up.
Feel free, go ahead.
No, I barely raise my voice, so this is how it's gonna get. Yeah, I'm gonna get out of vocal fry and go a little higher. So I totally agree about time and place. And I know it's just kind of a thing we have to do to succeed in this world. But I always go back to the whole thing of who is defining how, or what is the professional setting? Who's defining what's professional? Why do we have to change the way we speak or the way that we sign in that setting?
Well, you shouldn't. But for example, if you're a translator or an interpreter, there are other people involved.
No, so, for sure. And then non-interpreting, in school settings, right? If I can't bring the language of my home to school without it being okay, well, that's what you speak at home, but here's how we need you to speak to succeed, kind of thing. But it's true that when you're interpreting, of course, you have to. I'm assuming. change to however the flow or if it's casual or not, which must be hard for y'all anyway.
It can be a challenge. It
can't always be I imagine that in professional settings sometimes there's funny things that happen that aren't meant to be funny, or all of these little things that can happen where you're like, how am I supposed to be professional right now? Or maybe you're not a child like I am.
Well, I think a typical example would be when you have to translate or interpret someone or something that you don't agree with, or maybe strongly disagree with. Not to name the elephant in the room, but
his name is Nigel.
Exactly. So that can be a challenge, and as a professional, you of course deal with it, but sometimes that can be something that you have to process afterwards or talk to somebody about, and it makes it more difficult, definitely.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the elephant in the room, and I didn't want to say it. I didn't know if it was if we were going to talk about it later, if we were going to talk about it.
Shall not be named.
I was referring to a blonde-haired elephant. Yeah.
Yes, I imagine that is very hard to interpret. You don't want to say that crap that he just said or whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
That's true.
And also, a lot of it is kind of nonsensical, right? What he's alluding to, but he doesn't actually come out and say it. And there's a Greek word for this that I can't remember. I've been trying to find it. But anyway. For this process of not saying what you're actually trying to say, but letting the listener fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so he's a master at that. But if you're actually trying to translate what he said, it's often gobbledygook.
Yeah.
We actually did a whole episode about that with a friend and a colleague who regularly does interpretation for the news, for TV. And there are strategies to cope with that, but it's a completely different challenge from what we usually do. That's right.
That actually brings up something really important, I think, and really offensive. That I'm the only American here, aren't I?
Yes.
This is all my fault. So the leader of my country, he sometimes switches into Spanish, or he says words from Spanish terribly, and he speaks Spanish. That seems like an interesting interpreting problem or issue. I don't know, because there was the whole thing, and it goes into accent discrimination too, where he was in Puerto Rico, and he was Puerto Rico, he was doing this really exaggerated, gross, interpretation of a Spanish accent.
Yeah.
And what do you do with that?
Like, yeah, do you translate the mocking that's inherent in his speech?
Good question. Has anybody ever had that? I haven't.
I haven't had it in a political context, but in like, yeah, I've had that sort of thing. I don't want to really go into it, but yeah, where they basically just are mocking other people. And I think this is just me. I think if you want to do a good job getting the message across and not just, doing the word by word thing, you have to also do the mocking. Otherwise, you basically lose the meaning of what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
So I think in that context, I would try to kind of ape whatever is going on and try to bring it into German as good as possible. But
imitate it.
Yeah.
I was explaining to some friends recently that I draw the line between if a speaker is being accidentally offensive, I'll pull them out of the muck. If I know they're doing it deliberately and they're actually trying to do whatever and they know they're being offensive and they're doing it themselves, then okay, I'll let them wallow in it. But again, it's a really difficult choice because I had a South African speaker once who his way of speaking and his way of structuring his talk was fine for the US it was perfect, for South Africa it was perfect, in the UK you kind of got away with it because they knew who he was and so they expected that. In France it just would have turned everyone off. And so as a service to him, I took what he was, I realized very quickly what he was trying to do and went, well, how would a French speaker achieve that same aim? Oh, I think they would do it this way. But that's a judgment call that you can only see if you were right in hindsight.
That's true.
Well, that's one question that's been on my mind for a few minutes now. So because you said, Megan or Carrie, I'm not quite sure that when people sort of criticize language or accent or whatever, it's usually not about the language, it's about the person. And I'm wondering why do people do this? I mean, is there an answer to this question? I don't know. Maybe you have you come closer to answering that question? Why do people think it's okay? Is it because we used to do it, in presumably less politically correct times? Do you have a theory about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think school helps. School is part of the problem, but I don't think it's just school. School makes it worse.
Yeah.
But what do you mean when you say school is part of the problem? I mean,
so school teaches you that there is one correct way to speak your language.
Yeah.
And obviously that is completely false. I mean, even if we just look at the standard dialects, there are many of them in English. There are many, or a few at least, in French, et cetera, but we pretend that there's only one. But even as setting that aside, I think people actually like to discriminate. I mean, we're certainly taught to, like, from young, in many different ways. This person's different from us because of X. This person's different from us because of Y. And then, we're now becoming more aware that it's actually not okay to discriminate on the basis of certain things anymore. But
like immutable things, right? So it's not okay to discriminate against immutable things you can't change. Not cool.
You shouldn't discriminate against, you should, okay, I guess there's some things you should discriminate against. Like, you're a Nazi, I'm going to discriminate against you.
Yeah.
Like many political opinions, I think you shouldn't be discriminated against just because you have that political opinion. You can disagree, we shouldn't be like cutting people out of our lives just for one, like, I'm not saying all political opinions, but there are, we have lots of gradations of political opinions and we should be allowed to have them. So social identities that are not immutable still should be protected.
Yeah.
I think about this in this way because I've been working with a refugee program here in Phoenix. And that's one of the things they talk about, like, you can be a refugee because of something that you can't change, but also because of something you could change, but you shouldn't have to, like a political opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's an aside.
Yeah.
But so why is it still okay for many people? I think it's because discrimination has been okay for a long, long time. And it's only very recently that we're starting to realize, hey, maybe it's not okay. I mean, some people always knew, but like socially, it's been acceptable for a long time. And language stays there, I think, because of Megan's right. That's the part where the staying power of it is probably coming from schools and other institutions.
And again, I think it's because it isn't something that's like, I can't change the color of my skin or where I'm from or whatever, but language seems to be this thing that people could change if they just wanted to, right? Like, it's okay if I discriminate against you based on your language because you could fix that. Like,
just
you
speak
don't
English.
have to be speaking that way. Yeah, exactly. Or like, that's why I kind of think it's still sticking around too, where people are like, no, it's okay that I'm doing this because they could better themselves in this way. It's easy.
Right. Even though it's not always the case that they can.
Right. Or why the oops. You don't curse.
I'll just bleep it out.
Why the
We have a
F?
beeper.
What do we want to? Or why the F should that person have to, right? So
so let's just take English. So are we talking about Americans learning English in Boston versus somewhere in Arizona, for example, and they discriminate against each other based on where they're from and the accents that they have? Or do we talk about okay.
It could happen.
Anything.
Yeah,
at any level.
Anything.
Yeah.
Wow.
So people do mock the Boston accent. I don't think anyone mocks the Arizona accent. It's too...
I know, there was a poor example. And I honestly just picked Boston because I'm engaged to a Bostonian, so I've heard that many times.
No, but it's real.
Wicked.
Yeah.
I can't do it. Wicked.
Boston.
I love hearing it. To be honest, I've really taken a liking to it. I love it.
I love it too. It's great.
So I grew up about 15 miles from Glasgow, and my mum is English, my dad is Scottish. I was taught, at home I was taught the Queen's English, nearing towards RP. Then I go into a school in an ex-industrial town in the west of Scotland and realise that kind of English is not going to last very long, or I'm going to have a bruised face every day.
Oh, yeah.
But the first question I got asked in primary school was, are you a Fenian or a Proddy? Are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And it's I think when we realise that language is about a kind of in-group, out-group identity thing, then we start understanding where a lot of this discrimination comes from, because it becomes a marker of, are you in my group or are you someone else? Are you with us or are you with them?
Yeah. And especially in school, you want to be part of the right group, I guess, or at least part of one group. But it's interesting what you said, because usually I think in my experience, it was the other way around, that I grew up in a region that has a rather strong accent, which has a bad reputation nationwide, shall we say. And in school, we all spoke with an accent, I think, even some of the teachers. And then usually what happened was that the higher the grade got, so the longer you were in school, I think that the softer the accent became, if I'm making sense. And then eventually when you go to college or university, usually you would just get rid of your accent because there were people from other parts of the country and you would sort of agree on a kind of standard variety. So that was always my impression, but that doesn't seem to be the case necessarily.
But I totally agree, because I actually had that same experience in school. I'm from another part in Germany where they also talk in a very strong accent, which is also mocked continuously. We're actually getting subtitles on German national television, which really pisses me off. That's
wow.
Sometimes, yeah, that's true.
Sometimes. But I remember distinctly, one of my best friends from high school, he came in from a proper big city in Germany back into my high school, and I was a country bumpkin back then, so that was like way back out there in the countryside. And he talked proper high German, and people mocked him continuously. They were like, "Oh, do you think you're better than us? Like, why do you talk like that?" Yeah. And that's just the way that he was raised. Like he tried to talk our accent, and it did not work.
He just tried to get it right
for anyone. Yeah, but he got mocked continuously. And then when I actually went to university, into the big city, people were mocking me. Well, they weren't really mocking me, but I was more like a zoo animal, like an exotic person. Like, ooh, look at him! He actually talks the local accent. Ooh, how exciting! And and it was really strange. And for me, it was the same thing. Like, eventually, when I decided that I wanted to become an interpreter, I was like, I can't continue talking like this with people being like, "Oh, that's so cute," or like, "Oh, where are you from? That sounds adorable." And so I was like, okay, I have to get rid of it. But I realized, and this is again going to the point that you were making, Jonathan, about, are you with us or are you with them? It depends on the client that I'm talking to, but you can use those accents to like, and this is going to sound horrible, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I hope that everyone who's going to hear this knows what I mean. But you can emotionally manipulate people by using the accent, and you can kind of like get into the good graces of a client more quickly when you use the same accent.
I saw you do that during the weekend.
I know. Well, it works.
It totally worked. Yeah.
It's not even just about the manipulation thing, but it's just kind of like, I see where you are, and I'm there with you, kind of like a we're in this together thing.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, I want to get the official linguist view on this, but is it okay when people start using their accent to gain social capital? I'll give you an example. I turned up to a job once. It was, I have my favourite booth mate grew up in Edinburgh and has quite a refined accent. She would kill me for saying that. And I grew up in the West, and we were doing a job for the Scottish Government on deep sea fishing policy, you know, the really exciting topics that we get. And the guy who was running the event came up to us and went, "You're both Scottish, aren't you?" And we're like, "Yes." He said, "I'm so glad we've got someone from the Highlands here today." You know, like, big deal. It's a Highlands. You know, most professional interpreters wouldn't have freaked out, or at least I hope they wouldn't have freaked out about that.
Mm-hmm.
But our possession of, in my booth mate's case, a fairly posh Scottish accent, in my case, a fairly west of Scotland accent, our possession of that accent actually granted us social capital, that the client was actually glad that we were there and glad that we didn't sound Queen's English. And part of me is like, well, you know, if someone's gonna, if identity and accent are going to be so closely tied together, why not let the people who have that accent actually use that for social capital if they possibly can?
Yeah, absolutely. Your accent is your accent. I think you can use it for social capital anytime you need to.
I mean, it's survival skills too. Like, just like you were saying with kids and in school, and they know that they want to fit in, so they'll start talking like their peers, right? Well, the same thing with this. I think it's, like Carrie said, it's your accent. It gets a little weirder if it's you trying to put on an accent that's not yours.
Except for the more standard one, like
right.
Because everyone kind of adopts that at some point if it's not theirs. But like if you're trying to like adopt some other region's accent, it can get a little trickier. Although that's what many actors do. But that does seem different. Acting does.
Yeah. Like here in America, it would not be cool if I tried to put on African American English.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so
that's not cool.
Yeah.
But that happens, right? I mean, that's...
I don't have it natively, but you know, because it's not necessarily the case that all African Americans have African American English, or that all African American English speakers are African American. But so I don't have it. But yeah, it happens all the time that people that don't have it natively will use it.
But Megan, if you don't mind me asking, did you grow up with another language than English as a child, or from your family background?
Spanish. Yes.
Spanish. Yeah. And Spanish was your, I guess, first or second language?
No. So I heard it, but my dad didn't speak it to me specifically because he was worried about in-group, out-group. So he was in Arizona, whipped for speaking Spanish in school. So he did not want to teach me Spanish because, you know, the whole go back to Mexico, being a brown man, like he did not want me to have any of that. So I actually didn't learn Spanish. I mean, I was around it all the time. So, you know, I know a little bit of it from just being around it. But yeah, I wasn't taught it because of this whole discrimination against Spanish, which is actually a proxy for ethnic discrimination against people that are of Mexican descent in Arizona. It happens. And it's still happening.
And other regions too, but mostly Mexico.
Yeah. I mean, here they use Mexican as a bad word, right? So like they could be like Guatemalan immigrants, and they'll be like everyone's just Mexican. Yeah, you know.
I mean, it comes to the same thing. If there's a running joke amongst Scottish people that, you know, if someone comes up and says, "I love your English accent," Scottish people go, "Really? My what?"
Thank you.
I think it's, you know, I joke with people that, you know, if I'm abroad, a lot of people will say, "I love your British or English accent." if I'm in Scotland, outside of the West, everyone will say, "It's great to meet a Glaswegian." And if I'm in the west of Scotland, they can pinpoint down to the town down to the part where I grew up. And it's funny because you don't realise how specific an accent can be until you're in an area. And I'm sure it's the same in Germany, that people will go, "Oh, you're from Aachen, or you're from wherever." And it's just because this in-group out-group thing is so granular and so detailed. I mean, I'd imagine in Mexico, people go, "Oh, you're from there, you're from there."
Oh, yeah.
And people don't realise that we're discriminating against broad brushstrokes when actually accent says far more about us than we could possibly imagine.
Yeah, the whole in-group tensions they're real. Like you're talking about, like in Mexico too. Like since my dad grew up on this side of the line or of the side of the border in Arizona, his Spanish is not good enough in Mexico. You know, like there's this whole,
Oh, wow.
you know, it's just quite not good enough. You say words that only Mexican Americans would say. We wouldn't say that here.
Yeah. So it's kind of neither here nor there, which is doubly frustrating, I guess. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we actually have an episode kind of on this, talking about this whole like border identity. It's very, very difficult. And I'm sure it happens all over the world in different ways, the kind of border identity. Even if it's not like an actual, although borders aren't real social construct. But you know, these kind
that's
of,
a whole side rail.
Yeah. These kind of borders. Right.
Yeah. So what about you, Carrie? Because you grew up in Canada, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Canada, of course, is famously bilingual, but not the whole country. So what's the TLDR of that? Or I guess, what did it mean to you, I guess, more specifically? What did it play any role in your childhood when you grew up?
So I'm from British Columbia, and that's probably the least French area of Canada.
All right.
Or at least one of the least French areas. So I grew up completely monolingual English, but my parents were very, especially my mother, very pro-French. They really wanted us to be bilingual and, proper citizens of Canada. But the French immersion, so I lived in this really small town called Prince Rupert, which is really close to the Alaska Panhandle. And that town that I lived in didn't have French immersion until I was too old. So my brother and sister both got to be put in French immersion. So they were, functionally bilingual growing up. And it just upsets me to this very day that the only one who ended up being a linguist didn't get that opportunity. French has this interesting place in Canada. It kind of depends on where you are, what region you're in, but there's a lot of antipathy towards French in many areas. Certainly in British Columbia, I saw a lot of it, like English only is better, blah, blah, blah. And it's really upsetting when you actually realize how important language is and how all languages are cool and interesting and can help open doors.
That was so shocking to me because I assumed America had like monopoly on being a-holes in other languages. I was like, no, only America.
No, everybody has this problem. Every country
everywhere,
has this problem. It shows up differently.
It's actually similar in Belgium because Belgium is officially, trilingual actually, if you count German as well. And I've lived here for about 10 years now, and I find it such a shame that they don't make more use of this bilinguality or trilingualism that they have, in school. And yeah, it's just so frustrating, especially if you have a somewhat linguistic or language-related background. So I completely relate to what you said, Carrie.
Are y'all trilingual? All y'all?
I'm
That's a good question, actually. It's a very good question. Jonathan?
Technically, I speak 4 languages: English, French, Glaswegian, and nonsense. I'm very slowly adding German, but German there's a proper linguistic term. German is hard.
Yes. I think if you ask a translator or an interpreter how many languages they speak, know, whatever, I think they'll always sort of squirm because they're so self-aware about what it takes, or that it's always a question of definition of what it means to know a language, to speak a language, of course, as you know as well, because of your linguistic background. So I don't know if I would call myself even bilingual or trilingual, maybe in the sense that I know several languages sort of kind of well. But I don't know, Alex, what do you think? It's kind of difficult to say, right, for us, because we're so aware of our limitations compared to native speakers, I think.
I mean, I guess we're kind of fumbling around with English, so that's kind of...
That was a humble brag right there.
No, I thought what Carrie said was really interesting about the whole French thing, and I'm just gonna, once again, just put this out there. We don't have to discuss it, but I think a lot of it has to do with colonialism, particularly when it comes to English and French, because I've actually experienced it here in Germany with a bunch of French interpreters when they had to interpret a few delegates from Africa, and I'm sure that, their accents is going to be difficult and it's going to be different, just like for English, when you get some guys from Pakistan or India or from China, they all have different accents, and that makes it, of course, very challenging. But they made it into, I don't know if that's what they intended, but it kind of felt like that African accent was like less than, like their French is less than ours. And I'm like,
it's the same with Canadian French, by the way.
Yeah,
yeah, and
that's
why I had to think of that when you said that, Carrie. I feel like that's often the case, or even for English, oftentimes when an Indian person comes over, but English is actually their native language, and then people will be like, oh, he speaks that weird Indian English, and I'm like, that's his native tongue. Like, what are you talking about?
It's just the way he speaks. Exactly.
Yeah, that's just his.
Yeah, there's so much discrimination, accent discrimination once again. And especially foreign accent discrimination. And apparently, at least in English, the accent that is the most, the accents that are the most discriminated against are Asian accents. So like Indian or Chinese or whatever. Yeah. And it's totally true. I saw it in Canada. I see it here.
Yeah. We see it played out all the time in student evaluations. Of like Chinese professors or Indian professors, right? Yeah.
There's actually a colleague in the UK who once did his master's thesis. I actually meant to contact him before this episode, but I completely forgot. And I'm just now thinking of it, so it's kind of too late now. But still, he did his master's thesis on accents, and he actually had some evaluations going. I forgot if it was with actual clients or the other students about just their impression of other languages, English accents, and it was kind of the usual, like French is very attractive and makes everything sound very sensual. Italian accents make everything sound very melodic. And then they actually ranked the German accent in the English language as the most trustworthy. So kind of like the listeners were actually saying, well, if this person has a German accent, that makes them very trustworthy. And he kind of broke that down into the images that
Alex is like, no.
But he kind of broke it down in his thesis, if I remember correctly, that the listeners equated the accents in English with the image that the country has, and the German accent was like, oh, it's very precise and very thorough, and the French is this, and So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, I don't want to try it, I tried long and hard to not have a German accent too much. So,
but it shows once again that it's not really about language; it's about social status, whatever.
It's all about our perceptions.
I wanted to throw this one back to our actual trained linguists. There's a very common thing that interpreters say to clients, and that is, please do your speech in your native language.
Thanks for bringing that up.
On the one hand, that sounds like linguistic discrimination, because I have met people who, at least on the face of it, and at least in terms of language skills as they would traditionally be tested, they're able to do the speech in their native language. But I think because interpreters inherently know that language is not just words, language is the impression that you're creating, we would rather even say to people who say, well, I can do it in English, no problem. If you do it in your native language and let an interpreter then interpret that, you'll probably come across better. And I'm not going to tell it just now because I wanted to get your view. But I have at least one story from my own career where I've seen a company's sales drop because their representatives came over from Italy and chose to speak in non-native English, when the next company's Italian representative spoke in Italian and were interpreted, and everyone loved them. And so it's kind of knowing, linguistically speaking, is there an allowance in this whole accent discrimination thing to say, well, knowing that exists, maybe sometimes you should almost not quite give into it, but sometimes accept that that's part of the social scenario, and look at ways of just using your native language rather than doing what we would call non-native speaker accent.
Yeah, so I think if you're in the business world, that there's all this discrimination. Maybe you should think about that and consider that, and use an interpreter to help you get your message across, because otherwise you'll be judged. I don't think it's fair, but lots of things in life aren't fair. And sometimes, especially in business, you just have to work with reality.
Yeah, and it seems if you are in a place where you're given, or there's money for interpreters, I mean, I could take advantage of that. And I think it also goes back to the whole trustworthiness thing. I mean, whatever it is in our brain that's like, okay, I trust this person more because they're not, quote unquote, stumbling over their speech or having all these pauses, because you might have those if you're trying to speak your non-native language. So I could see why that sales dropping thing actually happened. Is you're seeing these people as less trustworthy, or you're not following their message as much, maybe.
And also there could be a feeling of pandering, like, oh, you're just speaking my language to make me feel better. I don't know so much about English. That might not exist as much in English, but I certainly in other languages I get this impression that if you don't speak perfectly, people are like, oh, you're just pandering.
It's like we call it Hispandering here, where people with politicians try to speak Spanish to the Latinos, and it's like, for one thing, Latinos in America don't all speak Spanish, and it's like also assuming that they only speak Spanish or they can't understand the English or whatever, and it's like, no, some of us don't speak Spanish, so we don't actually understand what you're saying now, and it's just Hispandering. So yeah,
that's cool.
Well, also in the case of like right now, the dreamers, so the people who basically grew up in the United States but were brought here when they were children, quote unquote illegally. There's this idea that they're all Latino, and they're not. Some of them are Korean, some of them are from other countries. So if you're speaking in Spanish to the dreamers, you're making an assumption that's completely unfair.
Yeah.
Yep.
It doesn't reflect.
And some of them don't speak they only speak English. Some of them.
Right, of course.
That's the whole point. Also, no.
Brought here.
And I think it's one of these things where I'm never sure. I've been asked a couple of times, guys, have you had this where clients have said, should I try a bit of French or a bit of German? And I'm never sure what the right answer is, because on the one hand, I'm like, I'm sort of glad when someone starts a meeting in Scotland with Gaelic. Thankfully, my usual boothmate speaks Gaelic, so it's fine. And I think, well, even though I don't speak Gaelic, it's nice to hear that. And I think, it's nice sometimes when British people make an attempt at something that isn't English, and even just say bonjour at the start of the meeting. I've had clients say, how do I say welcome to Scotland in French? And I think, well, it's probably pandering, but, it's making an effort. And it's gonna sound okay, and it is gonna be okay. And I'm never sure, because I've heard so much from linguists about cultural and linguistic appropriation, and I'm never sure where that line is.
Yeah, for me, I think saying a few words in the language is a nice gesture.
It's polite,
It's when you're doing it too much. So I don't know if you guys saw this, but the Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, went to India and then wore nothing but Indian clothes the whole time, which was weird.
Right.
Like if it was one event, it would have been totally fine. It's been done before, but it was the entire time, and there were multiple different outfits, and it was
maybe he lost his suitcase.
Yeah, right. The Prime Minister of Canada.
I'm just trying to make excuses. I think he's cool.
I mean,
he flew with United.
There are certain things about him that are cool, and there are certain things about him that are less cool. And this was more pandering. And if he had just worn it for one or two events, it would have been a nice gesture. But wearing it all the time becomes pandering. So I think there is a line between showing that you care and being like, oh, look at how awesome I am.
Very true.
I have another topic that I really wanted to talk about, but I don't know if it's maybe too much. But you had an episode about pronouns, which I've found extremely interesting, because that's a topic I've been thinking about a lot, and that we've been discussing as well, not on the podcast yet, but just unofficially, as it were, which is just I don't know what the term is, gender balanced language or
non-binary.
Or non-binary, yeah, because. See, that's the whole thing. I'm really interested in the topic, but I sometimes feel like it's a bit of a minefield to get into, because
because people don't all agree. So
that's right. But what I found so nice about your episode was that the person that you had on, I think she was quite open about it. There you go. They were quite open about it, and saying, well, you make a mistake, and then you can say, okay, sorry about that, and then you fix it, and then you keep going. And I think that's just a very nice approach to the whole topic, because it's so difficult for people to just make that mental switch.
Right.
Yeah, I do think it can be a little tricky. So I mean, I use singular they, but in the past it was always for, like, even if I knew the person's gender, it was just more like the gender's not important, so I'm just going to use
exactly, yeah.
But I never had used it for an actual person, like that was their gender, until Kirby.
So really?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know some other people who call themselves non-binary, but I've never referred to them like enough for that to come up.
Right.
So, yeah, it is a bit of a shift, but.
But I think in English, it's actually quite. It's not as hard as it is in other languages.
Oh, yeah.
So
German, for example.
French, I would imagine, or in German.
Yeah.
I have no idea what you would do in French.
Or German, trust me.
Yeah. I don't know German as well.
Yeah. No, but I think in English, I think the they is. I try to use it as much as possible because I just find it more inclusive.
Yeah, me too.
So I don't think that's a big issue, but in other languages, I can really imagine that creates huge problems. And I know that in Germany, a colleague of mine and I, we usually try to kind of sort of gender, even, Alex in the bar camp that we organize, like we try to gender the emails and try to be inclusive and not just, because in Germany, usually you have the generic masculine versions. Even if you talk about men and women, you usually just use the male version, and that kind of encompasses everyone. So we try to like gender it, and then we said, well, that's actually kind of impractical in a way. Yeah. So we just kind of flipped it and now made it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We talked it for a very long time how we were going to do it, and then we eventually just decided that we're just going to do the generic feminine term for everyone.
I love
it. So that felt better, especially for interpreting, where like 75% of the people working in the profession are women anyway. So it just felt like it made more sense.
But has it ever come up in interpreting or with colleagues? Was it ever an issue when you were working in the booth, not knowing, what to call a person or how to refer to a person?
Well, French has this wonderful pronoun "on,"
that's
which
right,
is kind of like we1. Where in Queen's English you would use the word one. Yeah, that can just be thrown in. I mean, it's not something that's ever come up for me, and to be honest, I might end up just going with people's names if I possibly can. But it's one of these things where whatever our views are on the background to that, there has to be an appreciation that language is always in flux. And I think this is, again, comes back to our language discrimination point, is I think especially most monolinguals, imagine language as a static entity and are surprised when they get words that change meaning. Yes. I still know people of a certain age, desperately trying to reclaim the word gay to mean happy. And
good luck with that.
But if you want to in that subgroup, and if your subgroup wants that word to mean that, well, the OED in the UK is actually a descriptive dictionary. It allows you to do that. And I think there has to be a realization that actually, even something like the word translation or interpreting, they mean different things in different subgroups.
Yeah, what was that? Carrie and I talked to someone from Ghana, and linguist in Ghana meant the spokesperson for the king, right?
Yes.
The chief.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So even linguist means something different.
And that's the thing. So, like, I know some traditional linguists are very tetchy about translators and interpreters being called linguists. Because most of us, if you ask us what phonetics are, we think it's some weird thing that you do when you're on your mobile phone. It's a phone tick.
That joke alert.
We go with the puns.
Yeah. Morphology is the study of little plasticine children's characters. That only works in the UK.
Yeah, that one.
When we realised that language is in flux and that language is socially determined and that meaning is not defined, it's actually negotiated. When we realise that stuff, which I think people who speak more than one language begin to get quite quickly, then language changes we just kind of allow to happen. Yeah, it's just, language changes. That's what it does.
Yeah, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's so frustrating. I had to have the same arguments over and over and over again about, say, the word literally, which has meant to a large amount, or like an intensifier for hundreds of years, since 1706 at least. It just meant that. So if you're trying to force literally to only mean in a literal sense, that's like hundreds of years too late. So stop it.
So now I wonder, how do you all interpret that? Do you have different, do you kind of see what they mean if they mean it like literally you have, okay. Yeah, as an intensifier versus. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it obviously depends on the context.
Oh no, please don't like that
No.
line already.
No.
This is cliche in the end.
No, that's the easy one. No, but usually it's actually
It's
quite clear, or it should be quite clear from
It's
what's
always
going
clear.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
even if you can, communicate it word by word, you still just do it with inflection or something along those lines. So you do get it across. But I just wanted to get back to the gender language thing because I actually listened to another podcast the other day, and it was hang on, just let me look this up real quick. The NPR Lost in Translation one on the power of language to shape how we view the world. And there was this Russian linguist on there who was talking about her. Oh, obviously, I forgot her name, naturally.
We can look it up. That's all right.
Yeah, I will. And she was talking about her studies in the US because she came over as a young child. And she actually invented a fake language where they just assigned genders to certain words and said, okay, this is going to be this and this is going to be that. And then they asked people to describe the nouns. And depending on whether it was a man or a woman, people contributed these sorts of traits to these made up words. But it was really interesting because first they did it with monolingual people who grew up with a gendered language where the words were the opposite gender, and then they did it for people, for example, like with English, where it's just the chair and the couch and the table and that's
bridge
it,
and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that was really interesting. I forgot what her point was about people who already speak a gendered language like Spanish, Italian, or French. For them, it was much easier to understand. But I think English people, if I remember correctly, they were quite struggling with the concept of like a female chair or like a male bridge, and they didn't quite. For them, it was just hard to grasp. I'm probably getting it all mixed up.
Yeah, no,
wrong.
because you have those associations. I think, if I remember correctly, if you say le pont, which is a masculine bridge, you would think of a bridge as strong and stable. Whereas when you say it's die Brücke, which is feminine, you would think of an architecturally beautiful bridge or stuff like that.
Yeah, something along those lines. Yeah.
I've always found this.
Women are both strong and architecturally beautiful.
Yeah, it's wrong on so many levels, right?
Yeah, women can push out babies. At least many of us can.
Yeah,
that takes a lot of strength. But anyway,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I came to the conclusion after the birth of our first child that women are tougher than any male Marine that you could ever come across. Because Marines do sleep deprivation training for about a week at a time.
Right.
Women with a newborn, it's about a year.
Yeah, good point.
So the woman's name is Lyra Boroditsky. I think that's how you pronounce her name.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I find it fascinating how when linguists do research on associations, they will often use invented languages. And it's like, there's a joke in Speculative Grammarian about the only good grammaticality judgment is my grammaticality judgment. And I think that this is I'm a field researcher, so I'm a little bit skeptical of lab research, not in general, but often I think lab research finds things which maybe it's just a result of it being in the lab. But I do wonder if you were to, get German people, monolingual Germans, to draw a bridge and talk about bridges, and French people to do the same, would there actually be that much of a difference? Because I think, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which underlines this, language determines your world. A lot of linguists are very, very skeptical / cynical about it.
Yep.
And I think it makes better it makes far better headlines than it makes good science.
I totally 100% agree. Now, I haven't seen this particular research, but I am already skeptical of it.
Yeah.
She's done work on this kind of stuff before. I've always found it problematic. It's not. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's a bizarre way of looking at the world. And yeah, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is either obviously true in the sense that it has a very, you do have the way that, or the language that you use does have some effect on the way that you think. I mean, I think that has to be trivially true, or else it's completely determinative, which is, to me, completely improbable.
Yeah.
Then you can never learn a new concept. You're trapped in the language you already have.
That would be so terrible.
Word for it.
Yeah.
Well, that would be sad.
One of the biggest problems for Sapir-Whorf, my translation theory lecturer was a guy called Ian Mason, who did our first 6 weeks on things that people think about translation and interpreting that are absolutely wrong. and why they're wrong. And it was really good because it means that you can have better conversations with people. And one of the things he said was research into bilingualism suggests that if Sapir-Whorf is correct, bilinguals have two brains.
Yeah.
Good one.
But this is the problem, and again, it comes back to language discrimination. What we think about language, I think monolingual people, especially, and even some bilinguals, want Sapir-Whorf to be true because it then gives some foundation to the fact that if you speak with a German accent, we somehow think you're more cold, calculating, and logical. Whereas my experience has been that the Germans that I've met have been some of the friendliest people I've ever met.
Oh,
but
yeah,
no one associates that with being
pandering.
German.
You're pandering.
It's true.
It's completely. I was just going to agree with you, Jonathan, because I actually have met, some interpreters here in Germany that have French or Italian in their languages, and when they're late, they're like, "Oh, I can't help it. My language is Italian. I just can't help being late." And I'm like, "Oh my god, like, what are you doing?"
Oh my god.
Yeah.
No.
Although I might try that. I might.
My Spanish is interfering.
I'll allow it.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
But do you know, one of the biggest shocks that people have is when they hear my accent, although I still say I don't have an accent as everyone else who speaks funny. People hear my accent and automatically want to give me alcohol. And when I explain that I'm Scottish and teetotal,
wow.
I've gone to I've gone to translation conferences with people who know about culture and stuff. And I say, yeah, I'm a teetotal Scotsman. And I had one translator say to me, "Do you exist?"
Does not
we're getting really philosophical here.
Yeah.
But this is, even in the heads of people who should know better, there is a theory that I read somewhere that everyone is a little bit racist. They're just not aware of it yet.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Oh, yeah.
And although I find that massively offensive, and I did one of the tests and I actually found out that I was whatever the opposite of that was. So I slightly, apparently I'm according to one of the tests, I slightly anti-white discriminate, which is really bizarre. But although that offends me, I can understand where it comes from.
Uh-huh.
And actually some of the people who give you the worst stereotypes are interpreters, but as one of my colleagues said, that's because some stereotypes have some truth in them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, what do you do with it? And maybe
well, sometimes a stereotype also helps you navigate a situation, just to get a first impression and feel the temperature of the room, and then but you still have to be open to be proven wrong, hopefully.
Yeah, also stereotypes help you, I think. Like, if you walk into a room and you're like, okay, there's a bunch of Americans, then maybe you know how you're supposed to talk to them versus you walk into a room and there's a bunch of English people and you know how they're supposed to talk to them.
How do you talk to Americans?
Loudly.
I mean, yeah. I mean, like, you don't say, "How do you do?" to a bunch of Americans. That sounds so bizarre. Yeah. That's what I mean. Like, so there's a stereotype of how Americans talk to each other. And I think, that's mostly-ish. Well, regionally true or racially true.
But by the same token, I wonder if people start feeling like they have to live up to stereotypes. So as an interpreter, one of the stereotypes that we have is that American speakers speak in a certain way, brash, outspoken, very self-confident, quite big on the body language. And the weird thing is that if you get like a couple of speakers from the same area, you sometimes can see people going, well, maybe that's how I'm supposed to speak. And I wonder if like the stereotype become a cultural determiner. So I was recently reading an article by an Italian interpreter saying, I'm an Italian and I can speak quite well if my hands are tied behind my back, thank you. And I'm like, well, yeah, but there is something about, again, it's maybe this in-group thing of we see the discrimination, we don't like it, we don't like the stereotypes, but if the person in front of us acts like a stereotypical American and we're American, we might try and fit in with that subconsciously because that's what we've seen as the archetype.
I think that definitely goes back to just survival skills. It doesn't even feel like you're gonna get hurt or anything physically bad's gonna happen to you, but you're just like, I need to fit in with my environment. I think that's pretty human thing to do. But yeah, this is stereotype of American. I have it too, but when I think of it, I think of a man always. It's always a man.
Yeah.
So Yeah, that's Yep. And of course, there are a ton of men in America that are overly confident and like stick their chest out when they speak and talk really loudly over you. Like
we have them too.
But that's, yeah, I was just gonna say, but that's just men everywhere sometimes.
True.
But I think
stereotyping here.
but I think American culture wants that, right? So
Right.
it rewards that kind of behavior. So I do think it is more common in the United States and in other countries that have different values.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Canada, that's not it's not as prominent. It's not as looked well upon to be too confident.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like the stereotype of Canadians of they say sorry after absolutely everything.
Or if you run into someone else, someone runs into you and you apologize.
You say sorry. But the Brits do
real.
that. They do that as well. Maybe not in Glasgow, but.
Well, they do that in Glasgow. Well, you also have. I mean, Scottish and British coexist in weird ways that I won't go into. But there is a thing of if you're in the UK and you hold the door open for someone and then you realise that they're slightly too far back and you have to stand waiting.
So awkward.
Yeah. Or the other one is who goes first in a queue. You first. Oh no, you. No, really you. I'm sure we've actually started wars because over who needed to go first in the queue.
Yeah.
And it gets really bad because nowadays with the whole people looking at rethinking gender roles and whatever, if as a man in the UK you open the door for a woman, you're like, am I going to be thanked or slapped? I'm not entirely sure here. But you should be doing that for everyone.
Yeah.
But again, it's this. I don't know how we got into that. But again, it's
hashtag tangent.
But I think language exists as part of social context. That's my senior PhD supervisor was always in, there's no such thing as decontextualized language. Again, it's why I'm so skeptical of a lot of lab work on linguistics and especially sociolinguistics and meaning, because meaning doesn't exist unless there's a context for it to take place in.
I mean, so some of the lab work that, at least for first language acquisition, I think has actually been very well done.
I do lab work in first language acquisition.
Feel free to jump in here, Megan.
But like the really old experiment of like the WUG test, I think that was really well done, and you can do it to any child and they will give you the exact same results. So I think lab work can be good.
Yeah.
Can we just for all the listeners, because obviously we don't totally know what that is, can we just explain
what's the WUG test?
Yeah.
So you have a picture of a creature. I don't even know how to describe it.
Bird-like.
It's kind of bird-like. Yeah, a big fat bird.
Yeah.
Very two-dimensional.
Like in Sesame Street?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but two-dimensional. Yeah.
Like two-dimensional. Okay.
Sesame Street with two-dimensional. Yeah.
Okay.
What is happening here?
Like more like a shape. Like a geometric shape that looks like a bird. Anyway, this is a WUG. Now there are two. There are two
WUGs.
And then the child fills in WUGs.
Every single time.
Like, wow.
Oh, wow.
Knows how to pluralize. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So lab work can be good.
Yeah. I mean, replicate, right? Just to make sure.
Absolutely.
Some lab researchers are garbage, of course.
Yes.
Because there's garbage human beings everywhere and every profession. But
I'm in love with you people.
But
I'm also oddly impressed by the WUGs test.
Yeah.
Isn't it great? It's so simple.
Yeah.
It's simple but so perfect.
Yes.
And I got it right too.
And do it with your kids if you have little tiny ones or any kids around. Not any kids around, there's some
that are learning English. But you could do the same thing in your language too, right? So if there's like a pattern of plural, like if there are different plurals, you test
and they did it with the past tense, like this is a dax or whatever. What is it? How do you do the past tense? How do you do the present tense? We are daxing. We are daxing. Yesterday we daxed.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I get
so
the
kids
idea.
can do that too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I am slightly critical of lab work, but I mean, as a field researcher, if we say everything, even labs are social situations, I'm happy when lab people say, we set up this situation and it was a constructed social situation. Then I'm like, yeah, okay. I think I'm coming from the background of a lot of lab work in interpreting has assumed that what interpreters are doing is taking purely, if you like, lexicosemantic information in language A and turning it into lexicosemantic information in language B. And there's no reference to intentions, there's no reference to purpose, there's no reference to, there's this entire setting around language A and language B. And I think that this comes back to almost a point that we made right at the beginning, is that language is a proxy for 1,000 other things. And my motto, which is becoming a bit of a cliche, is when I started out as an interpreter, I thought interpreting was language skills with people attached. I'm now convinced that it's people skills with language attached. And through those eyes, I'm beginning to see that actually even some of the things that we look at as terminological decisions are actually social decisions. A classic one, I was interpreting with a group of interpreters at a truck factory, and my poor German colleagues had spent, I don't know how long, memorizing the German for a dumper truck, which being German has a few syllables in it. And after 4 days...
Yeah, but an accurate one.
Yeah,
an accurate one. So after 4 days of trampling through mud after these trucks in horrendous conditions, at the end of it, the German delegate said, "Oh, we just say die Dumper."
Nice.
And I'm like, that is not a terminological thing. That's a social thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we should do some lab research on this.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
So the new topic, and I wonder if this is actually a good segue into code switching, because I don't think what Jonathan was describing was necessarily code switching. I think that was just a weird terminological thing for that particular German delegate.
But he has a PhD,
No, but I did want to pick your guys' brains on code switching, because I find the concept fascinating, but I don't think I know enough about it to actually speak intelligently on it.
Amen.
So
I think this is Megan's
over
area.
to you.
No pressure, Megan.
So what Jonathan was talking about was switching one word, right? So that wouldn't be code switching. That would be borrowing. Yeah. Code switching can be at the dialectal level and at a language level. So you can switch between, say, Spanish and English, and you'd be code switching if if the interlocutor that you're speaking with also speaks both Spanish and English. So you wouldn't be code switching in Spanish and English to a monolingual English speaker, right?
Right.
So people that can code switch are very good. They have such great metalinguistic abilities, and we know that about bilinguals, multilinguals anyway. That y'all have really great metalinguistic skills. You know what your partner in speech or in sign need and are doing. So speaking in Spanish and English both at the same time. It could be like at the sentence level or at a paragraph level. Those are all different kinds of code switching. But you can also code switch dialectically. Say you have African American English, and you also you can also speak Southern English without like the specific features of African American English. I don't really know a situation when. Can you think of one, Carrie, where someone might want to use both of those?
Well, they're more similar than other.
Yeah, they're pretty similar.
Dialects, so I would probably choose just standard American English and say African American. And you'll definitely hear people switch between them.
Yeah. So it could be, but when you're throwing in like one word or when.
Right. Yeah. That's why I wasn't really sure that was an appropriate.
Yeah.
But I was actually thinking about it in the very beginning when we got started with the podcast, because we were saying, or one of you was saying that we don't speak in the professional interpreting situation like we would speak to our friends or somewhere else. So that's sort of a code switch into like.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you're putting your professional hat on, and that's your different.
It's kind of like a register switch.
Right.
Yeah.
Code switching usually means like you're using two languages in the same sentence rather than switching from one situation to another situation. Although some people use it that way. So I think the podcast code switch, that's really how they're using it.
They do, yeah.
But linguists,
NPR,
so our jargon, we mean it usually within a sentence or maybe like from one sentence to another, but you're still speaking to the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book that I recently read for Linguist List called Speak English or What, and it was looking at interpreting in small claims courts in New York City.
Ooh.
And he was saying that one of the biggest interpreting challenges and procedural challenges there was that the predominant way of using language wasn't monolingualism for the non-native English speakers. They were predominantly code switching. Now, he says, now, traditional interpreting ethics has no room for that. Traditional court setups have no room for that. The arbitrators in his situation would say, well, if you know the English for this, why do you need an interpreter? Or the interpreters would then do a rendition with the term still in English that they'd heard in English. And it's, now, as an interpreter, code switching is a bit of a nightmare for me because we have to make very quick decisions. And it's, if they've said it in English, should I then drop it in French in my version? Should I, what do I do with this? Because especially reading that book, it's made me realize he had the phrase code switching is always motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize that it's motivated, you then have to think, I'm a professional public speaker as well. If it's motivated, what are they doing with this in a kind of Gracian term? What are they doing with this word?
Sometimes I think, though, it's just that that's the word they remember first.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's just an access thing.
Yeah. And not to say that they don't have, like, I don't want to, Carrie's right. It's an access thing. It's not like a lack of knowledge thing. Because I hate when a lot of people will talk about code switching. And they're like, oh, they code switch because they don't have that knowledge or they don't have that information in that language. And it might be true.
Sometimes it's true.
But I don't want that to be like the overriding narrative of why people code switch. I like the access thing much more. Because a lot of people will frame code switching as a, what is it?
Like deficiency?
Deficiency.
Yeah. And usually, I mean, I think it could sometimes be deficiency, like, word for smartphone. Maybe that's the only one is the English one.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just the English word came to my mind first. And sometimes it is motivated, like I want to make a point. And so that makes it even more complicated because what do you do with that?
Or maybe always like if you have a partner that you're speaking with that does have the other language as well, maybe you always say a certain phrase in English because it's just easier in English than in your native language.
Right. Yeah. And I think for interpreters, it can sometimes be a lifesaver if you don't have the right translation or the right term in your target language, but you have to keep moving. You'll just throw it in the source language and be done with it.
Well, also we use it in our house. My wife is a fluent German speaker, and I have little bits, and sometimes I will ask her something in what is basically pidgin German, when I don't want our children to understand what I'm asking. So apparently, sometimes I get it grammatically correct, and other times she says she has to think really hard to work out where I've made the mistake. But it's this idea of we've all come across the access problem, we've all come across issues, and it's working out what is it doing here. Although I know Grice has been massively criticised in places, I think there's a lot going for the way that he talks about. I mean, the very title of his book, How to Do Things with Words, there's something about what he was trying to get us to understand, I think, as linguists and as interpreters. Fundamentally, that's what we're doing, and that's what the people that we're working with and studying with are doing all the time. They're not, picking words out of a dictionary, they're making meaning.
Yeah.
And that's so important to understand.
It's interesting that the book called it code switching. So you do think that what they were doing was code switching? It wasn't actually, in this case, a deficiency issue?
Well, he was very keen to only give the deficiency issue as much ground as the data suggested it was a deficiency.
That's good.
And so his argument was that actually from what he could tell from their ordinary everyday life, they were living in code switching and code mixing. So his argument was, if this is what they're doing every day, why would court be any different? And he says there are times when the English term for whatever if it was a dispute about housing, the English term rental agreement might be more accessible than the Spanish or the Turkish or whatever, because that's on the piece of paper they signed.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, there may be a case where they're just doing that because they're disagreeing with the way the interpreter's interpreting their case. And so they'll code mix to clarify, no, it's not a this, it's a that.
Right.
Do you have to be specifically trained to do court?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. I think
you also have to be insane.
I wonder about, because I'm very interested in how court interpretation happens, because it's so important, especially with all the immigration issues that we have in the United States.
Yeah.
There are people that are from Guatemala that speak indigenous languages that we don't have anyone that can interpret for them.
Right.
And it's a really big issue. And I wonder if it's ever happened to y'all where you're supposed to interpret, but someone uses a language that you don't know. Does that ever happen? Mm-hmm. Like maybe you're interpreting French and then they bring in another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happens. But maybe we can actually put you in touch with Judy Jenner, who was on our last episode, because she does a lot of court interpreting in Las Vegas for English and Spanish. So, you know.
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, definitely.
And she is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
But it's funny because, and this is another thing that I have read, she wrote a book with her twin sister. And when I met them in person, it was really strange, because have you ever felt that someone's voice when they were writing sounded different to the voice when they were speaking?
Oh, yeah.
And it's really strange how my internal voice of what the Jenner twins sounded like did not sound like the way they actually sound. That's a whole other topic. Sorry, we do have a script somewhere. Yeah. I was going to say, because we're language policy and official languages, that is it kind of comes into that a little bit with courts trying to say, you're in this country, speak this language. I'm fascinated by the Quebec case. For one reason, because when I was living in France and I first heard a Quebecois person speaking on TV, I literally asked the guy I was staying with, why is that American speaking 100-year-old French?
That's a good way of putting it.
But it's good that you picked up on that, because when I heard Quebecois for the first time, I didn't understand a single word. And I technically knew French at that point.
But it's the strange thing, because on the one hand, I can understand why, if you're a minoritized group, why fixing language policy would be really important, because there would be, there are still tensions in metropolitan France over, we don't want to lose our distinctiveness as the French-speaking people, and so they have the Académie Française, and they say things and everyone ignores them. But it's fun. Oh, of course. We are not going to say La Toile d'Araignée Mondiale. No one's ever going to say that for World Wide Web. But it's this thing of almost the colonial language policy only makes real political sense if you're a minority group. Because then there is turf that is realistically under threat. If a UK English Academy came out, it would be hilarious, because the main threat to UK English is UK English speakers.
Yeah, it definitely has to do with power. So if you have all the power, you don't need to create a bunch of things to save your language. Right. It's ridiculous.
But yet they do.
They're trying.
Well, they try, but it's not. There's nothing quite like the French versions.
I don't know. Spanish is pretty terrible too with their academy.
Okay, maybe.
Is there an Académie Québécois? Because that would be. I would love there to be an Académie Québécois.
I don't think there's. Well, maybe there is. I shouldn't say this, but there are very strong laws about what you are allowed to put on your menus or on your signage in Quebec.
Yeah.
So, for example, there was a pet shop in Napierville. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I apologize. In Quebec.
We'll fix it in post.
Napierville.
Napierville? I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, Napierville, Quebec. And the episode was literally called Pastagate, and there's my Canadian accent.
Pasta. I got you.
So there's an agency, there is a French language watchdog agency. I don't know what it's called, but there's a parrot in this place, in this pet shop, a parrot. And it refused to speak French.
Get out.
So that was the first one. And then the second one was Pastagate, where an Italian restaurant used the word pasta instead of translating it into French, and I don't even know what the word for pasta is in French.
Pat.
But they got mad at that.
Yeah.
They're also trying to stop people from saying bonjour hi in Montreal and just say bonjour. And it's just Montreal is really the only truly bilingual city in Canada, at least of the big ones, and you're trying to make it only French. So,
Didn't you do an episode about swearing in Quebecois as well? Or was that another podcast? Am I getting my podcast mixed up now?
we did an episode on swearing, and we included some stuff on French, Quebecois French, because it's so fun.
Yeah, like tabarnak.
Tabernacle.
Tabarnak.
I love it.
See,
yeah, it's so good.
I would almost expect that to be Utah swearing.
Yeah.
Except they're not Catholic. Is that a Catholic thing?
Yeah, but tabernacle
Yeah.
is just part of
Mormon
Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In
You know,
fact, I
but-
think it's even part of Judaism, or should, because I think it's
Yes,
like Old
it is.
Testament.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
But I mean, I think this is the thing of the. I'm aware sometimes. I was telling the guys on a previous episode, there was a very recent job where we had a female Irish trade unionist who was speaking in really street English. And it was a really funny thing because French trade unionists, as a rule, tend to act and talk like mini philosophers, whereas British trade unionists, as a very general stereotype, tend to pride themselves on being guys who are still on the shop floor. And so already when you have these two groups in a room, you have a cultural difference within a shared political ecosystem. And this Irish speaker got up and spoke quite street English
Colloquial.
and said, the way the British government have dealt with such and such is disgusting. And my boothmate did what I thought was a brilliant translation choice. But a French delegate came up to her afterwards and basically said in French, we don't say that word here. We say scandaleux, which is like, 3 shades less than disgusting, especially the way that she said it. And it's one of these things is we're always operating in between worlds. And I sometimes forget how important the kind of official French is for French speakers. Even those who might take the mick out of the académie, there's still a pride in proper, lovely French that's not necessarily there the same for native English speakers. And it's reminding myself sometimes that actually the formulation there is as important as the content of what's said, even if that means thinking of how this would reformulate into their world.
By the way, I found out what the name of the watchdog is.
What is it?
The office is Québécois de la langue française.
Oh, okay. Does it have a nice acronym?
Pardon?
Does it have a nice acronym?
QLF?
Okay.
But they use
That's not
office.
No.
sexy.
They use office and not bureau. Wow.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
And they're going after parrots. That's their job. Are they proud of
And
that?
pasta.
Parrots.
Basta.
They're going to change your name to parrots and pasta. When you first said parrot, I thought you said pirate, and I would thought we were going in a completely different direction.
I'm just imagining people walking into the office after listening to this podcast and being like, are you proud of yourself? Are you?
But on the other hand, it recently allowed grilled cheese, softball, and drag queen to be acceptable French words in Quebec.
Oh, really?
Really? Well, there you go.
Le
The
drag queen.
essentials.
La drag queen.
Le drag queen does sound like you would hear it in Paris.
Yeah.
But shouldn't it be la?
La drag queen, yeah.
Ah, no, there's
Back
And
on
with
gendering.
a cigarette in just circling back to the stereotypes.
Can it ends in a consonant?
But I think on that note, on la drag queen or le drag queen and
La drag queen.
which one we say where, I think we should probably
That's
start
true.
wrapping it up because
Yes.
this kind of like encapsulates everything from French and Quebec and the gender and
That's right.
different. I think it's a good time. I was wondering if you guys wanted to maybe just each of you say one little takeaway that you had. It could be comedic, could be fun, could be nothing, but just like one little thing, because I thought this was a really interesting episode that was all over the place in the best way possible.
Exactly.
This is going to take so much energy.
No, like I really mean it.
We're
No, I
very
think-
messy.
If I can just go first, I had a great time. So this was really a great discussion, and like almost a discussion that you would have in the pub, I guess. So certainly,
that's how we like to think of ourselves.
yeah, exactly. But what I find so great is that there really seems to be a whole scene of language-related podcasts. I mean, some have been around for a long time, like the World of Words, for example, which has been around for a long time. And it's just so great to see that there are so many podcasts looking at language from so many different angles. And then sometimes it's just so great to see when they kind of come together, like you did this crossover episode with the two ladies from Lingthusiasm with Gretchen and Lauren, which is also a fantastic podcast if you're interested in, linguistics, I guess. You should definitely check that out. So that would be my comment.
I forgot, and I knew once, I forgot how important y'all are, interpreters. And I think about in America, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and how it made it so that you have a right to an interpreter if you don't speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important. Did I get that right, Carrie? That's in that act, right?
I don't know. Why are you asking me?
No, I think you're right, Megan. I think you're right.
Yeah. I was like, I'm saying something so definitively and with so much confidence, like a stupid American.
Everybody would have totally been good.
Yeah, you just have to own it.
American right now. No, I mean, shout out to 1965 Civil Rights Act anyway, but I'm pretty sure that's what, we have the right to an interpreter if we don't speak English. It's really important, and it really means a lot to me that, wow, I almost got kind of sad. And like compassionate. Sorry. No, but it's really important work. I know y'all are in America doing it, but people like you in America are doing it. And you're doing good work where you are.
Great, thanks.
What an important and practical thing you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the pandering.
Thank you.
It's a Terp pandering. Nope.
Well, I mean, she's wearing a headphone. I feel like that's very much pandering to what we do on a daily basis.
Although it should only be on one ear if you're in a Terp.
That's right. But Carrie, you were going to say?
Yeah, that reminds me. I meant to say this way earlier in the conversation, but I had to look up what terp meant.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. It's lingo. Jargon.
It makes total sense once you know, but
yeah.
I was
just troublesome interpreters was a mouthful, so
yeah. No, it totally works. It's just something we don't know.
And y'all seem to be into alliteration, so
I guess so.
Like boys in the booth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one day we're going to release an album of the three of us trying to sing.
Oh my god!
I did not know that.
Alex, can we edit this out?
Yeah, we'll edit this out.
Christmas next year. No, I think what I took away from it is, I took two things away from it because I can never do one thing.
There's always two things with you.
Yeah, it's always one of the things I took away from it is language is weird.
Mm-hmm.
And language is probably weird because people are weird.
Yeah.
And the second thing I took away from it is the language is far more than words. And to realize that every day what we're doing is we are creating and recreating language every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And when we realize that that's what's going on every single day, it's actually exciting and worrying in the same level. And I'm just glad to see so many other people looking at language and going, this is strange. There's a saying that scientific discoveries don't start with, look, I've discovered that they all start with oops.
Yeah.
And if you don't look at language and go oops, you're probably not looking hard enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes you have to look at it in the lab. I'm just saying.
Oh, nice.
I did joke recently that the first rule of field linguistics club is that all interesting languages happen near sunny beaches.
Oh, that's what I did wrong. So I did most of my field work in like either North Vancouver, which is just across the water from Vancouver.
Is it actual fields?
Yeah, I know, barely counted. I took the sea bus. Or I was in the Arctic.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah, I went the wrong direction. I should have learned some Spanish and gone down to Mexico or something.
Yeah.
We'll get a redo next time.
Yeah.
I did my field work in the south of England and in Bonn in Germany. And Germans still think I'm really weird that I love Bonn.
Did you see my face? I was like, ooh. I'm sorry to all my colleagues in Bonn. It's a beautiful city and I love all of you.
Yeah. We'll cut this out.
At least it's not Frankfurt.
Oh, here's the dissing.
Mic drop.
Alex, is that your takeaway?
Who doesn't like a takeaway Frankfurter?
I had
Exactly.
that takeaway years ago. No, actually, my takeaway was for everyone who knows me knows that I'm not, or everyone who knows me knows that I'm not a very theoretical person. I'm not really into like research or stuff like that. I think my master's ruined me for life because that was the worst experience I've ever had writing that thesis.
Oh,
But
that's a whole nother episode right there.
talking to you, yeah, I know, right?
We need to get
Discussing my PTSD.
Yeah.
Writing. No, but actually talking to you guys made me really interested in a few of those more theoretical aspects of linguistics. And I know Jonathan is probably like jumping up and down here.
Mission accomplished.
So what I took away from this is that I don't know. I already knew this. There's so many things that we can talk about with language, with linguistic discrimination, with how we think about the meaning of a sentence and how to translate that into another language, and how that's not ever going to be exactly 100%, because even though I am a very formal linguist, so I am like all about the math, I still recognize that obviously there's much more going on when we use language. And I love it all. I am such a language nerd.
Yeah.
So thank you for having us on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for being on my show.
Wait.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by Chris Ayers for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com.